Seen from above, the city looks as though it has been copied and pasted. In Moscow, Kiev, Minsk, Tbilisi, Riga, or almost any other major city that once belonged to the Soviet Union, entire neighborhoods are filled with nearly indistinguishable rectangular blocks. 5, 9, or 12 stories. Rows of windows spaced exactly the same. Balconies repeated from one end to the other. Facades painted gray or beige, or faded by winter. Between one building and the next are broad courtyards, trees, schools, and pedestrian paths. A visitor can walk several blocks, turn 2 corners, and experience the strange sensation of having returned to the starting point. At first glance, all the blocks seem identical, but the longer you look, the more unsettling the question becomes. How did cities separated by thousands of miles end up with such similar buildings? How did tens of millions of people living between the Baltic Sea and Central Asia come to occupy practically the same apartment? And why did a country capable of building marble-clad subway stations decide to surround its cities with concrete boxes repeated almost endlessly? There is a quick answer. It says the Soviets simply lacked creativity. The government controlled architecture, architects obeyed, and the inevitable result was an ocean of buildings with no personality. The explanation seems reasonable. After all, when hundreds of facades repeat the same sequence of windows, it is easy to assume that no one tried to do anything different. But one look at the rest of Soviet architecture reveals the first problem with that theory. The Soviet Union produced monumental buildings, enormous universities, palaces of culture, exhibition pavilions, sanatoriums, monuments, and extraordinarily sophisticated subway stations. In Moscow, some stations were designed as underground halls, complete with mosaics, sculptures, chandeliers, and luxurious finishes. Across different Soviet republics, architects combined modernism, regionalism, brutalism, classical influences, and structural experimentation. The country had professionals capable of creating bold forms, so the repetition of its residential districts cannot be explained simply by a lack of talent. The second answer blames ideology alone. According to this interpretation, the buildings were identical because the state wanted to make all residents identical. Architectural uniformity would therefore be a direct representation of Soviet collectivism. There is some truth to this. Central planning favored universal solutions, housing was allocated according to administrative rules, and official rhetoric promoted a relatively standardized material life. But ideology alone cannot manufacture millions of tons of concrete, or explain why a particular wall had a specific dimension. If the only objective had been to express equality, architects could have created hundreds of different buildings with equivalent apartments. A city can communicate collective values through public squares, shared facilities, and planned neighborhoods without repeating exactly the same structural components. Ideology helped determine who would build, for whom, and according to which priorities. But the block's final appearance emerged from far more concrete decisions. Panel dimensions, crane capacity, distance from factories, available steel, and assembly speed. The third explanation claims that concrete was to blame. The material was supposedly heavy, gray, and incapable of producing variety. But concrete does not force a building to become a box. It can create curves, shells, domes, cantilevers, and sculptural facades. Some of the 20th century's most expressive buildings were made from reinforced concrete. Even precast panels can incorporate colors, reliefs, textures, and varied combinations. The material offered far more possibilities than Soviet residential districts generally revealed. The problem was not what concrete could do. It was what an industrial network built to manufacture millions of standardized components was equipped to do. A factory fitted with molds for a specific panel could produce that component quickly, every day, for years. creating an entirely new panel meant redesigning molds, revising calculations, reorganizing production, adjusting transportation, and changing construction site procedures. Formal freedom existed, but every variation carried an industrial cost. The fourth explanation seems the harshest. The buildings were ugly because no one cared about the residents. That idea gains force when we see tiny kitchens, poor sound insulation, leaking joints, and neglected facades. Many of those criticisms are justified. Some buildings were poorly constructed, and pressure to meet numerical targets frequently undermined workmanship and comfort. But dismissing the entire program as indifference erases the enormous problem it was trying to confront. There were not enough homes. To find the true origin of those blocks, we need to return to a Soviet Union shaped by decades of violent transformation. Industrialization drew millions of people from the countryside into the cities. Moscow, Leningrad, and countless industrial centers grew faster than their housing stock. Apartments designed for one family were divided among several. Individual rooms became complete domestic units, while kitchens, hallways, and bathrooms were shared by people who often had no relationship to one another. Then came the Second World War. Cities were besieged, occupied, burned, or destroyed. Homes disappeared, just as millions of soldiers and workers had to be relocated. After the war, industrial reconstruction received enormous priority, but the housing shortage continued to grow. Families lived in barracks, dormitories, basements, and communal apartments. In some cases, 4 or 5 people occupied a single room. The problem was not providing a larger living room. It was providing a door that one family could close. During Joseph Stalin's rule, the Soviet Union also built solid, ornate residential buildings now informally known as Stalinkas. Many had high ceilings, thick walls, elaborate facades, and relatively spacious apartments. But they were expensive, slow to build, and dependent on large amounts of skilled labor. They served certain urban groups and lined monumental avenues, but they could not be reproduced fast enough to house the entire population. A residential palace could impress a city. But how many families remained waiting while it was being built? Nikita Khrushchev turned that question into national policy. Even before becoming the Soviet Union's leading official, he had already followed experiments in industrialized construction. Khrushchev didn't see housing as merely an architectural problem. He saw it as a production problem. If the country could mass-produce tractors, locomotives, and machinery, why was it still building homes through so many slow, handcrafted processes? The solution would be to transfer a growing share of construction from the building site to the factory. In December of 1954, Khrushchev delivered an important speech at a national conference of builders, architects, and construction workers. He criticized high costs, delays, and what he considered unnecessary decoration. The following year, an official resolution condemned so-called excesses in design and construction. Cornices, decorative columns, ornament, and complex facades came to be viewed not merely as aesthetic choices, but as materials and labor hours being taken away from apartment production. This shift is often interpreted solely as a war on beauty. But the logic was mathematical. If the budget could produce one ornate building for 100 families or 2 simplified blocks for nearly twice as many, which should be chosen during a housing emergency? The government's answer was clear. Quantity, speed, and cost should guide the design. Residential architecture would no longer be judged primarily by the uniqueness of each facade. It would be judged by the number of families removed from inadequate living conditions. In 1957, the Soviet government launched a program promising to radically accelerate construction and reduce the housing shortage. The plan called for expanding prefabrication, multiplying component factories, and repeating economical designs on a national scale. Between 1956 and 1965, approximately 108 million people moved into new homes, many of them in standardized five-story blocks, according to a historical overview published by Cambridge University Press. That number reveals the true scale of the investigation. This was not about designing a few hundred buildings. Millions of apartments had to be produced, while new factories, neighborhoods, and cities continued attracting workers. The 7-year plan, covering the period from the late 1950s to the mid-1960s, called for roughly 15 million new housing units, an amount comparable to everything built in Soviet urban areas since the revolution. To reach that target, the traditional construction site would have to change its very nature. Imagine a conventional masonry home. Bricks arrive at the site, mortar is mixed, walls rise slowly, and different crews complete each stage. Weather affects the pace. Measurements vary. The more details the design contains, the more skilled labor it requires. Now imagine entire walls, already containing window openings, being produced inside a factory. Floor slabs, stairs, interior panels, and sections of the facade arrive at the site almost complete. A crane lifts each component, workers position it, and the connections are made. The building is no longer constructed brick by brick. It is assembled. That is the logic of prefabrication. Instead of performing almost all the work at the final location, components are manufactured under more controlled conditions and transported to the site. It is similar to the difference between building a car by hand and assembling one on an industrial production line. The first can be unique and carefully customized. The second can be repeated thousands of times using the same parts, tools, and sequences. In Soviet large panel systems, a single concrete component could form most of one room's wall. Some exterior panels left the factory already containing a window opening and layers of insulation. Interior walls could function as load-bearing elements. Floor slabs spanned the distance between them. Precast stair flights connected the stories. Bathrooms were even tested and manufactured as nearly complete modules. The fewer wet processes required on-site, the faster assembly became. The construction site began to resemble an outdoor production line. Trucks delivered components in a calculated sequence. A crane picked up a panel, swung its boom, and lowered the piece into position. Workers aligned, braced, and connected the element. Then came the next panel, the next slab, and the next story. The pace depended less on masons building walls by hand and more on coordination between factory, transportation, crane, and assembly crews. If one component arrived late, the entire sequence could stop. That is why standardization was far more than an aesthetic preference. It organized a logistical chain. When thousands of panels share the same dimensions, the factory uses the same molds. Inventory becomes simpler. Workers repeat familiar tasks. Trucks carry predictable loads. Cranes handle similar weights. Engineers don't have to recalculate every building from scratch. Even doors, windows, plumbing, and furniture can be designed around recurring dimensions. Savings also came from avoiding errors. In a one-off building, a new detail can create uncertainty at the construction site. In a series repeated hundreds of times, problems become familiar, and crews learn to execute every connection quickly. Designers can correct a defect and apply the solution to subsequent units. It is like manufacturing the same automobile model for several years. The more it is repeated, the more predictable material consumption, training, and production time become. These standardized designs were grouped into series identified by numbers and codes. A series defined the structural system, panels, stair placement, apartment dimensions, and possible combinations of sections. The same building could be extended by repeating modules, as though additional cars were being added to a train. Instead of giving each neighborhood dozens of entirely new designs, Planners selected series compatible with the factories available in that region. This explains why buildings in distant cities look like close relatives. A factory could supply several construction sites within its logistical range. Another region might receive a similar series, sometimes adapted to its climate, available materials, or local regulations. The system did not produce one universal Soviet building. It produced families of repeatable buildings. At a glance, they all seem identical. To engineers and residents, differences between series could determine wall thickness, kitchen size, thermal insulation, and room arrangement. The best-known example is the Khrushchevka, the popular name associated with housing built on a massive scale under Khrushchev. Many had 4 or 5 stories, structures made from concrete panels or brick walls, and extremely simple forms. 5 stories was not an arbitrary choice. That height accommodated many families without requiring an elevator under most of the adopted standards. A 6th story would increase residents' daily effort and could require expensive equipment, along with maintenance, energy, and mechanical space. Eliminating the elevator reduced costs. Shorter hallways saved floor area. Combining the toilet and bathroom simplified plumbing. Aligning kitchens and bathrooms around the same vertical service shafts reduced piping. Lower ceilings consumed less material and decreased the volume that had to be heated. Kitchens could measure roughly 54 to 65 square feet. Every inch saved in one apartment seemed insignificant, but multiplied across millions of units. It became mountains of concrete, steel, glass, and fuel. The apartments were small, but they gave many families something revolutionary: privacy. They had their own kitchen, their own bathroom, their own front door. Children no longer had to cross a communal hallway to reach a sink shared with strangers. Comfort might be modest, walls might transmit noise, and the rooms might feel cramped, but the social change was enormous. A family no longer occupied just one room. It controlled an entire housing unit. In Novaya Cheryomushki, on the outskirts of Moscow, different technologies were tested in experimental blocks during the second half of the 1950s. The neighborhood functioned as a laboratory for a new kind of residential life. Low-rise buildings were separated by green spaces, schools, daycare centers, and pathways. Cars were not supposed to dominate every space. Everyday services would be distributed throughout an urban unit known as the microrayon, or micro-district, designed to bring housing and essential facilities together. The micro-district also favored industrialized construction. Blocks could be positioned with enough space for cranes to operate. Facades were oriented to receive sunlight according to insulation requirements. Schools and children's areas were kept away from primary traffic routes. In theory, the objective was not merely to scatter concrete boxes across the landscape. It was to organize a functional urban life around them. But when the same volumes were repeated carelessly across enormous areas, the plan's efficiency began to exact a visual price. One particularly well-known series was the K7, associated with engineer Vitaly Lagutenko. It used large panels and was assembled throughout Moscow on a massive scale during the 1960s. Another series, the 1464, spread across several Soviet regions. Brick Khrushchevkas also existed, demonstrating once again that the repetitive appearance did not come from concrete alone. Designs, dimensions, and methods were standardized even when the construction system changed. The concrete components, however, introduced their own difficulties. Joints between panels had to remain watertight and insulated. Minor defects allowed water and cold air inside. Thermal bridges could create freezing areas along interior surfaces. Variations in workmanship produced misaligned walls. In extremely cold climates, a poorly sealed connection was not merely a finishing problem. It could mean discomfort condensation, and deterioration. Factory speed did not eliminate the need for precision at the construction site, and that speed had another consequence. Once a city invested in a factory, molds, and a transportation network for a particular series, replacing the design became expensive. Changing the width of one room might require a new panel. The new panel required another mold. That change could alter the floor slab, facade, stairs, and utility layout. What appeared to be a small architectural decision spread throughout the entire industrial line. Standardization saved resources, but it also made the system less flexible. This is where the investigation reaches its central revelation. Soviet apartment blocks looked alike because they functioned as industrial products, not as individual works of architecture. Every panel was equivalent to a catalog component. Every series operated like a model. Every factory possessed specific tools. Every construction site acted as an assembly station. The repetitive facade was the visible image of an invisible infrastructure made up of standards, trains, trucks, cranes, molds, and national production targets. The system solved part of an enormous problem. Between 1956 and 1963, approximately 10,400,000,000 square feet of housing were produced in the Soviet Union. Studies of the program indicate that, beginning in the late 1950s, more than 2 million units were completed each year. Millions of families improved their living conditions, although waiting lists and housing shortages never disappeared completely. But numerical success produced a new crisis. When efficiency, speed, and economy dominate every decision, a city can lose its visual landmarks. A resident left block number 17, crossed a courtyard, and found block number 19 with the same entrance, the same windows, and the same color. Streets were no longer defined by continuous facades and instead passed through collections of freestanding buildings. In well-maintained neighborhoods, trees and public amenities softened the repetition. In others, empty land and inadequate maintenance intensified the sense of monotony. Even Soviet authorities recognized the problem. By the 1960s, efforts were already underway to vary colors, cladding, block placement, and facade treatments. Regional institutes adapted series to different climatic conditions. Balconies, loggias, and decorative elements received new combinations. But changing a building's surface appearance was easier than modifying the structure manufactured by the factories. The city could repaint its products, but it still depended on the same assembly line. Under Leonid Brezhnev, later generations popularly known as Brezhnevkas emerged. They did not form a single model, but a broad collection of series built mainly from the second half of the 1960s onward. Many were taller, with 9, 12, or more stories. Elevators and garbage chutes became common. Kitchens and interior spaces grew larger in many series. Separate bathrooms and more comfortable layouts appeared more frequently. This evolution shows that the system did not remain frozen. The first-generation Khrushchevkas were an emergency response based on extreme cost reduction. Brezhnevkas tried to preserve industrialized construction while correcting some of its shortcomings. But greater height required elevators, protected stairways, more robust structural systems, and more complex utilities. The appearance changed, but the logic remained. Repeat standardized series to continuously supply a national housing industry. Not every Soviet residence was built this way. Brick buildings, special projects, individual homes, cooperatives, and blocks designed for specific locations continued to exist. Moscow was not identical to Tashkent, and Leningrad was not identical to Kyiv. Climate, culture, materials, and regional institutions introduced differences. The mistake is confusing the most visible part of mass housing with all Soviet architecture because the contrast between central monuments and standardized neighborhoods reveals the different functions assigned to each type of construction. Today, decades after the Soviet Union disappeared, many of these buildings remain occupied. Some have received exterior thermal insulation, new windows, roofs, plumbing, and colorful facades. Balconies have been enclosed individually. Air conditioning units have altered the elevations, and residents have transformed apartments that were originally standardized. In some neighborhoods, trees planted when the blocks were new have grown large enough to conceal much of the concrete, creating urban environments far greener than winter photographs usually suggest. Other buildings face serious problems involving maintenance, accessibility, and energy efficiency. Joints need repairs. Utility systems have aged. Small apartments no longer meet the expectations of many families. In Moscow, redevelopment programs plan to replace thousands of older blocks, while other cities prefer to renovate them. Demolition also generates controversy because these buildings contain established communities and represent an enormous quantity of energy and material already embodied in their construction. The fate of the Khrushchevkas shows how a supposedly temporary solution can become permanent. Designed during a moment of urgency, they outlived governments, economic crises, and the country that built them. Their apartments were renovated, sold, inherited, and personalized. Behind apparently identical facades, millions of interiors began telling entirely different stories. Standardization managed to repeat walls, but it could never repeat the lives inside them. Now we can return to the aerial view from the beginning. The blocks remain aligned. The windows are still repeated. The facades still appear to have emerged from the same machine. But what looked like nothing more than a lack of imagination begins to reveal something else. An industrial system attempting to solve a housing crisis on a continental scale. Every wall represents a decision about material. Every story without an elevator represents a cost savings. Every series points to a factory. Every neighborhood records the attempt to transform architecture into mass production. That effort brought privacy and infrastructure to families who had previously lived in communal rooms, dormitories, and barracks. At the same time, it produced monotony, cramped layouts, technical limitations, and cities where visual identity was frequently sacrificed. There is no simple answer that turns the program into either pure triumph or absolute failure. It solved real problems, created new ones, and left behind an urban landscape that still shapes the lives of millions. Soviet apartment blocks look alike because they were not designed to represent individuals. They were designed to solve, as quickly as possible, the problem of housing millions of people. And if you enjoy discovering why homes, buildings, and cities take forms that seem strange until we understand the engineering and history hidden behind them, subscribe to the channel and follow the next videos.